Once an enemy cracked, the Romans did not surround them. Instead, they usually left an easy escape route so that the cavalry could come in and cut them down as they fled. By 270 BC, Rome controlled much of the Italian peninsula. But unlike many ancient powers, it did not simply pillage its defeated neighbors. It turned them into allies, sometimes offering them Roman citizenship.
That way, as Rome expands, the people whom it conquers are integrated, form part of the Roman army, and become the troops for the next wave of conquest out. So it's a cumulative process. And that, I think, is key to the success and the growth of this empire.
Rome's expansion made a clash inevitable with Carthage, another Mediterranean superpower. And when that clash came, it would produce the most horrendous war the ancient world had ever seen. Rome's expansion in the 200s BC brought it into conflict with another empire across the Mediterranean. The city of Carthage, in modern-day Tunisia, commanded an empire stretching across northern Africa. In 264 BC, Rome and Carthage began fighting over control of Sicily, where Carthage had colonies. Rome found itself at a disadvantage. Carthage had a great navy, and Rome had almost none. Rome began building one, but most of its soldiers had never sailed, so they practiced on dry land, pretending to row in unison to get a feel for it. And when it came time for the real sea battles, Rome had a trick up its sleeve. It developed a kind of gangplank called a corvus that hooked onto Carthaginian ships so that the Roman soldiers could board them, turning naval battles into more familiar land battles. And that way, Rome routed the Carthaginian fleet. Rome won Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia. But Carthage did not accept the defeat. In 218 BC, Carthage hit back under one of the most feared warriors Rome would ever face, Hannibal. And this time, the target was Rome itself.
Hannibal was a man clearly with tremendous determination, a great personal hatred of Rome, which he'd inherited from his family who'd fought the Romans before. And it's also very clear that he had great personal magnetism.
Hannibal marched his army through Spain and France and across the Alps into Italy, accompanied by 36 elephants.
Most of Hannibal's elephants died on the journey over the Alps. In fact, his elephants played absolutely no role in the subsequent campaign. Nevertheless, they represent the skill and boldness that Hannibal portrayed in coming over the Alps so early in the campaigning season and surprising the Romans.
With the help of Celtic warriors who joined him on the way, Hannibal won early victories against Roman legions sent to meet him. Then, in 216 BC, came a major showdown at Cannae in southern Italy. Hannibal had about 40,000 troops, while the Romans and their allies had nearly twice that number. But Hannibal was a master tactician. When the Roman legions made their usual thrust towards his center, Hannibal let them advance and then encircled them. It was a disaster for the Roman army. Some 50,000 Romans and allies were killed. There was panic in Rome, with cries of "Hannibal is at the gates." But Hannibal was never able to capture Rome, because Rome's ingenious policy of creating allies paid off once again.
What defeats Hannibal is the fact that the Romans have got 8, 9, 10 times as many men able to be impressed into the army as Hannibal has got. And they can lose 50,000 men in a day. And they keep on fighting because they've got the manpower. No other state in the ancient world could ever achieve anything like that.
Rome practiced total war against Hannibal. As an emergency measure, it called up every available man, even slaves, and sent legions to Carthage-held Spain to stop supplies and reinforcements from reaching Hannibal.
The wars on this scale are fights for survival, literally for survival. If you lose these kind of wars in the early period, your city is destroyed, your women and children are dispersed across the Mediterranean world. That's the end of it. All societies are destroyed if battles are lost.
It took 15 years of fighting before Hannibal was forced out of Italy. He returned to Carthage to defend it against a counterattack by the Romans, who finally defeated Hannibal in 202 BC. But despite the victory, Rome maintained a paranoid fear of Carthage and provoked a third war in 149 BC. It took the Roman legions 3 years to breach Carthage's huge city walls, and then the Romans slaughtered unknown thousands of Carthaginians and sold 50,000 survivors into slavery. Finally, the Romans leveled the city, plowed it into the ground, and according to legend, sowed it with salt, so that nothing would ever grow there again.
Any Roman army was capable of extreme brutality, particularly in the sack of a city which had resisted them, which they then managed to break into. And under those circumstances, it seems to have been normal Roman practice, almost policy, to slaughter absolutely everybody and everything, including animals. Everybody was just chopped to pieces. It was absolute carnage.
After defeating Carthage, Rome also added Greece as a province, after destroying the city of Corinth. Many other conquests followed, so that by 100 BC, Rome was undisputed master of the Mediterranean. The Romans justified their expansion in a way that many modern-day politicians would understand.
They always convinced themselves that they fight defensive wars. No Roman war, no matter how offensive or imperialist it might look to us, to the Romans it was always a matter of defense, always fending off an attack. So in a sense, that's how they justified a Mediterranean conquest.
As rulers of a rapidly expanding empire, the legions had to get used to a lot of traveling, and that meant travel on foot. When Roman soldiers marched, they carried up to 50 pounds of equipment on their backs, including weapons, armor, cooking utensils, rations, and tools for building a temporary camp. Most armies relied on natural defenses, but the Romans carried the tools to build a new camp wherever they were, a new one each day, if necessary. They dug a defensive ditch around the whole camp, 5 feet wide and 3 feet deep, then built a palisade with the stakes they carried with them. It was as though the Romans had their own fortified city wherever they went.
The primary purpose of a Roman marching camp is psychological rather than military. It's the idea that in enemy territory, every night you make a small city in what is not your territory. And the enemy look on, seeing their territory pockmarked by the advance of Roman armies.
The camps were a typical example of the Roman passion for order. Every camp had an identical plan. Each leather tent was put up in the same place each time, so that the soldiers knew exactly where they were.
The soldiers had a great sense of security during the night. They knew exactly where their officers were, and the fact that their comrades were guarding them as well.
The Roman obsession with order extended to the discipline of the troops. Camp sentries who fell asleep could be stoned to death for having endangered the whole regiment.
It wasn't as exceptional as it might sound, given the general background of what Roman society was like. People were used to flogging, they were used to fairly frequent public executions. So the Roman army was indeed pretty draconian, but not as different from the rest of society as perhaps we might think.
One infamous form of harsh discipline was decimation, the killing of 1 man in 10 of regiments that showed cowardice in battle. The men were selected by lot and clubbed to death by their comrades. Roman obedience was based on fear.
If a Roman soldier was faced by a crisis in battle, that Roman soldier, that unit of soldiers, would stand their ground because they were more likely to survive a desperate fight in battle than to survive if they ran away.
One famous case of decimation came when Roman legions suffered several defeats during a revolt led by an escaped gladiator, a warrior called Spartacus. The Roman army was so busy conquering and building an empire on foreign soil that it had no standing army back home in Italy, and that left it open to surprise attack. That was what happened in 73 BC in a revolt led by a foreign slave named Spartacus, who'd been forced to become a gladiator.
Conditions for all slaves were relatively cruel and brutal, and particularly for gladiators who were kept chained in barracks and were brutally treated.
Spartacus led his fellow gladiators in a revolt against their conditions and was soon joined in the uprising by slaves from the countryside.
Millions of slaves were brought back into Italy, and a lot of them were prisoners of war, a lot of them were ex-warriors. And therefore, although many of them were kept in barracks and many of them were trained to be gladiators, they were a potential security risk.
Because there were no legions stationed in Italy at the time, new legions had to be quickly raised and trained. But Spartacus and his men, using guerrilla tactics, defeated each legion sent to meet him, and his band remained at large in Italy for 3 years. The Roman Senate finally gave the nobleman Marcus Crassus the power to quell the revolt. To show he was serious, he began by decimating 2 of the legions that had lost to Spartacus, then raised 6 new legions and met the Spartans in open warfare.
Their tactics were so unconventional. They refused to give battle until the very end in a conventional way. They confounded the expectations of the generals and the armies sent against them. In a sense, their mistake and what lost them their final battle was to behave like Roman soldiers, to fight a conventional pitched battle. Had they stuck to guerrilla warfare, their revolt might have been even more effective than it was.
The legions defeated the rebel army and killed Spartacus. And then Crassus lined the Appian Way outside Rome with 6,000 crucified Spartans, a lesson to anyone who opposed Rome and her army. In the early days of the Roman army, soldiers were called away for only a few months at a time between spring and harvest time. But the expanding empire meant long campaigns overseas, and for property owners, the only men eligible for the legions, military service became an ever-increasing hardship. By 100 BC, Rome had about 130,000 men in uniform. 1 Roman man in 8 was a soldier. And he was required to do 6 years of service in one stretch and a maximum of 16 years over his lifetime. The legions needed a bigger pool of manpower to draw upon, and the man who made it possible was the consul Marius, himself a great general. Twice he had saved Rome from invasion with victories over German tribes. In the fields near Aix-en-Provence in southern France in 102 BC, Marius's army killed so many Germans, 100,000 by one account, that farmers had bumper crops for years afterwards because of the blood and bones in the soil. As consul, Marius decided to throw the ranks open to all Roman citizens, whether they owned land or not. This meant poor Romans could volunteer for a secure and prestigious job with good pay and travel. They could become career soldiers. The Roman army was now on its way to becoming a full-time professional force. But volunteers still had to meet strict requirements. They had to be tall, preferably literate, and have good character references. Certain professions were preferred, including blacksmiths and hunters. Those considered not suitable included weavers and tavern keepers. New recruits had to pass an interview and a medical examination.